Good morning, everybody. Nice to see everybody. And for those I've not seen already, Happy New Year. Welcome to the first uh, People in Place Practice Network of 2026. Is it a Happy New Year? I'm not entirely sure. Been watching the news this week or reading the news this morning. Things are all quite challenging. I think wherever we are, locally and globally. Um, but obviously, we're here to kind of have a look at the difference that policy can make in place. And our agenda for today is primarily in response to the Scottish budget. So we're having an overview of the Scottish budget from the 13th of January, which we know was already delayed. And so we've invited Juan Pedro Castro from Future Economy Scotland, who have been doing analysis of the budgets recently. And so we thought it was an opportunity to take a sort of wider look at the implications of the budget at a sort of larger scale, not just a place focus or a regeneration focus, but just across the board, what it means for the next year or for the next couple of years within Scotland. And as part of that, my colleague Augustin will also do a sort of quick summary of what the actual budget for Regeneration looks like for next year. And then after a break, we will be looking at the Surf Manifesto, which will, I suppose, pick up on some points. I think we had an event in July last year, which looked at the Surf Manifesto as it was in an earlier stage. It's something we've been working on for more than a year, and we launched it at the beginning of this month. So we'll be going through, Augustine and I will be going through that and sharing with you why it looks the way it does, and what our four key asks are for the next Scottish Parliament. But it is good to see everybody this morning. It's the usual sort of format. It's fairly informal. We'll have presentations from Juan Pedro and Augustin, and then we'll take some questions and have a discussion. You can either have the discussion in the chat or put your hand up, and it would be lovely to see your face and hear your voice. And then we'll have a break, and then the same sort of format for the second half of this morning. The plan is to run it until 12. If you have to leave earlier, that's totally understandable. And if it finishes earlier, that's also totally fine with us as well. So to start off this morning, Juan Pedro Castro, would you like to share your
Yeah,
presentation with us?
absolutely. Thanks, Ewan. Let me just go through the process. Okay, hopefully that should be
Yep,
working.
that's working for us.
Perfect. And yeah, so it's a pleasure to be here. As Ewan said, I'm gonna talk through our sort of like analysis of the 2026-27 Scottish budget, which we've called, well, we did a blog which we called Tough Choices Delayed, Not Avoided. But just in case people in the room don't know Future Economy Scotland, we're a relatively new think tank working to decarbonise, democratise, and decommodify the economy. We're non-partisan and aim to sort of bring sort of both radical and evidence-based contribution to the kind of Scottish economic and think tank kind of analysis space. And the plan for the presentation today is to give a bit of context to the the budget and sort of the political and fiscal space in which it came about, and then talk a bit about what was actually in it, both at a very general level, and then some analysis that we've done of some of the more uh, headline grabbing policies, and finishing up by sort of looking ahead at what this means for the election and the next parliament. Okay, so in terms of context, as probably most of you know, Tuesday, a couple of weeks back, on the 13th of January, was the sort of big fiscal event of the year in kind of Scottish Parliament. So the government proposed and like presented the 2026-27 budget in Parliament, alongside two other less frequent sort of fiscal documents, the spending review, which sets out spending plans for the next 3 years, and also the infrastructure delivery pipeline, which sets out sort of capital spend plans for the, in this case, I think it was 4 years from the next year. And this would be the last budget pre-election in May. So we sort of expected a mix of safe choices that don't annoy too many people, uh, with some sort of voter-friendly policies that kind of help the government make some of the kind of prepare some like good lines pre-election. Um, and but taking a further step back, before sort of the 13th of January, I think uh, it's maybe useful to reflect sort of what the Scottish government has been trying to kind of achieve over the past years, and what the situation is on those fronts. So I think it's fair to say there's been like very kind of strong and ambitious kind of policy kind of plans in place, but there are perhaps some signs that in some of the key areas of policy that have been identified as like the top priorities for the government, delivery, or at least like outcomes have been falling short of that ambition. So, for example, in child poverty, this year marked the publication of the sort of child poverty statistics for the interim child poverty targets year, and the government sort of missed that target despite seeing some reduction in child poverty, uh, and sort of like a better performance than other nations in the UK. Um, and on climate change, the government also in the past year and a bit has had to update its emission reduction commitments, and there's now a kind of climate change plan going through Parliament. And on living standards and sort of the economy more generally, the government has this sort of stated goal of sort of inclusive growth and well-being economy that are still used in a lot of government documents. Um, but the economy remains not only sort of sluggish, as this slides say, but also potentially there hasn't been that much change in terms of sort of like inequality and those sort of socioeconomic outcomes. Um, the fiscal context to the uh, well, yeah, the fiscal context to the government, to the budget were sort of tricky, which I think sort of suggests that uh, maybe if further, perhaps further prioritization and resource was needed to like get the dial moving again on those sort of three government priorities, that was going to be tricky in the context of sort of the financial kind of space. So the medium-term financial strategy, which was published in June 2025, so only half a year ago, painting a very challenging fiscal picture. In the slides here, there's the projected resource, so day-to-day spending and funding outlook for the years from 2025 to 2029, 2030. And it shows that there's a gap with the resource spending projections, which are based on sort of assumptions of expected needs over the coming years, being relatively higher, well, significantly higher than the resource funding expected from how much money they expect the government expected to raise from taxes and to get through the Scottish like UK government block grant. Um, yeah, the gap grew to 2.6 billion by 2030. But even in 2026, 27, the gap was already projected to be 963 million on resource funding alone, with also a quite challenging, even potentially more challenging picture on the capital side, with 1 billion capital funding gap expected already in this sort of coming year. Um, so the government has sort of called on the UK government to agree to an early review of the fiscal framework with a view to expanding its borrowing capacity, but that's sort of medium-term changes, and the budget was kind of was going to have to face up to these challenges. Um, there were some changes that came mostly from UK government choices between the publication of that medium-term financial strategy in June and the budget. And I think top three maybe takeaways from the UK budget in December were the abolition of the two-child limit, which is of course welcome policy, but also for the Scottish Government, it meant it sort of freed up some resources that was planned for mitigating the two-child limit within Scottish Government resources. There was also some additional UK government spending in devolved areas, which meant some additional funding in this coming next few years through Barnett consequentials, and also less sort of monetary. But I think there was also some policy openings through sort of UK government decisions on mansion tax, and also through decisions on taxing income from property separately to income from earnings from like wages and self-employment, which meant maybe it opened up some options for the Scottish government to also take some decisions in those spaces as well. So yeah, moving on to the budget, at the very sort of high level, um, what what happened? Um, so I think uh, we were sort of quite surprised as we were sort of watching the delivery in Parliament live, as the budget seemed much more action-packed than we expected. It was framed very strongly as a cost of living families or a budget for kind of Scottish families. Um, and there was a lot of sort of headline grabbing policies, but actually um, often without that much detail. And when we sort of started digging into um, the actual kind of budget documents, the picture that emerged was kind of somewhat different. Some capital spending. There's been significant cuts of 10% over 800 million for 2026-27 compared to plans that were laid out in that sort of medium-term financial strategy. We haven't looked into the details of the, the capital investment pipeline to know sort of what specific projects have been cut. But no doubt that that scale of budget cuts will have an impact on how many projects do actually go ahead. And then on day-to-day spending, on the resource side, there's been uh, growth in real terms relative to the previous budget year, but a significant fall of around £500 million relative to those kind of medium-term financial strategy plans. So sort of like a mixed picture there. And on the kind of portfolio level, we haven't digged so much into the kind of specific budget lines, and I'm really keen to hear kind of how people have experienced the budget from their own kind of organizations and kind of policy areas of interest. But at the high kind of portfolio level, the main winning area is health, which I think sees the biggest year-on-year growth, um, and the other portfolios like local government grow very slightly, but there's potentially like accounting kind of specific things happening, and also the sort of that medium-term picture over the next 3 years is actually kind of quite challenging. So and on that medium-term picture, the spending review set out a plan to try and close that fiscal gap that the medium-term financial strategy presented, and it relies heavily on efficiencies, sort of efficiencies in delivery, which are kind of is slightly underdefined, and there's a bit of a question around like how those are going to be delivered without impacting on service delivery. So that's the sort of high level picture. And I think the key message from that is there's sort of like the fiscal space is challenging, and there's already signs that some budgets are being cut with potential impacts, for example, from infrastructure on like long-term kind of health of the asset base and service delivery. So we have warned that if Scotland wants to maintain its social space, its social kind of safety net over the coming years, there will be no choice but to kind of raise additional tax revenue and be quite serious about tax reform. We haven't quite seen that in the budget. Instead, there's been a mix of sort of headline grabbing, but actually quite minor policy changes. And I'm going to go through sort of the four of them. The first one being decisions on income tax thresholds. The government decided to uplift the the bottom two thresholds by 7.4%, which is more than inflation, and freeze the other three thresholds. And this picture here sort of shows what the income tax schedule looks like as income grows. What's your marginal tax rate? And the change is just the difference between the yellow line, the yellow dots, and the green dots in the sort of 16,000 and 20 something thousand area. So you can see very small changes, but it allows the government to claim that most taxpayers pay less income tax in Scotland than they would under UK government rules, a claim which was sort of under threat over the past year because of like changes in earnings growth and so on. This change, as I said, is quite small. It's up to 32 pounds a year for households that or individuals that benefit from the full freeze. And it's actually higher earners that benefit the most, as it is all taxpayers above those thresholds that experience the change, not just those on low incomes. And actually, we've done some distribution analysis of the reform. And this chart here shows the impact on disposable income of households, ordered from left to right, from the 10% on lowest income, the 20% on lowest income, up to, on the far right, the 10% 10% richest households, and it shows the impact of both the decision to uprate the lower bands and to freeze the higher bands relative to what would have happened if the income tax bands would instead have been uprated with inflation, as is sort of the default for the government. And we see that actually the reform overall is quite progressive in that it falls, the additional cost or additional tax falls mostly on higher income households. But the 7.4% uprate actually has some regressive features in that it benefits most those in middle incomes, middle high incomes, and that's because lower income families just rely less on earnings and therefore pay less income tax in the first place. The second kind of headline grabbing policy was the reform to the Scottish Child Payment, with this additional small child uplift implemented, and we think this is very welcome. It's gonna kind of move additional resources to families, that priority families that are more likely to be in poverty, and also a family that is perhaps kind of where concerns about labor market incentives are less at the forefront, because like the early years, there's going to be some movement away from the labor market, and we need to support that. And so while it's welcome, it's relatively small, and we think therefore the impact on child poverty is likely to be also very small. This graph here shows again by decile, so by group of ordering the population by income. It shows sort of what deciles are, what groups of people are receiving more Scottish Child Payment. And in light blue, there's the normal Scottish Child Payment before this change. And we see that it was a very effective policy at moving money towards families in the lower deciles, which is what you would expect from like a social security policy that's aiming to tackle child poverty. And in slightly darker blue, well, yeah, slightly darker blue, there's the impact of this sort of new young children uplift. And you can see, again, it's effective at moving resources towards low-income families, but the change relative to the pre-existing policy is relatively small. So while welcome, this is far from sort of job done on child poverty. And if the government wants to achieve the sort of the very ambitious final child poverty targets, or even eradicate poverty, as is the stated ambition, we think more is going to happen. More is going to have to happen across all drivers, including social security. The third policy is the like a Scottish mansion tax, quote unquote. So the government announced 2 new council tax bands on property values valued above 1 million, which mimics the UK government mansion tax, but instead of an uplift, is sort of integrated into the council tax system. but there was not that much detail shared on the policy, like the actual multipliers, how much money, where are the bills going to be, hasn't been kind of shared, or how the additional revenue is going to be brought into kind of the adjustments that happen to council, local authority level grants. And in any case, we expect the change to be quite small. So while it's pushing the council tax system to be less regressive, which is welcome because it's one of the most regressive taxes we have, we expect less than 0.5% of households to be affected and only 14 million raised. So it's a reform that sort of tinkers with council tax, introducing some small adjustments rather than substantially reforming what is like a relatively like inefficient and unfair tax. So we think like more needs to be done on council tax and local property tax. And finally, there was a private jet tax announced. So with the sort of the rollout of air departure tax, which is going to come in from April 2027, a year on, there's going to be a private jet supplement added to that. The details again have not yet been announced, but I think we think the policy itself follows the common sense principle that heavy polluters should pay more tax, and it's a good way of tackling both inequality and climate at the same time. But we don't expect huge amounts of revenue to come from this. So summing up the budget, we think the sort of the challenging fiscal situation is already leading to tighter budgets, particularly on capital, but also on day-to-day spending. But maybe because of the way things have been presented with like quite headline-grabbing policies, the bigger impacts are not yet obvious, or the government has to use sort of short-term funding pots like revenue from ScotWind to cover gaps. There's been some welcomed reforms that we've gone through, but they're often quite small and will not be fully rolled out in the actual coming budget, but sort of later on. And we think like one cautionary point is this sort of fact that the government hopes to find 1.5 billion of efficiency savings over the next 3 years to meet the budget kind of constraint. And if this doesn't, like, there's a question over to what extent this is feasible without impacting frontline services. And just looking ahead, as I said at the beginning, the fiscal situation facing the government is difficult, and we think the budget itself can be defined as sort of avoiding, delaying difficult choices rather than avoiding them. Given the tightness of the budgets and heroic assumptions around efficiency gains and pay awards, there is a risk that the government will not actually be able to deliver on these commitments over the next few years. So the options for the next government after the election, we think, are quite clear. Either raise more revenue or face a return to austerity and an impact to services. And if taxes are to rise, then there's the obvious question of which taxes and on whom. And we're doing some work on this at the moment. And there's going to be a report on fiscal reform coming out probably in late February. And we're sort of looking through like a range of devolved taxes and find that a lot of them are actually ripe for reform. So we mentioned council tax through the presentation, but also LBTT and other taxes, and also income tax, which has been used already by the Scottish Government to raise additional funds and support like a more generous social security system, for example, which is a positive thing. But we think potentially it might need to do an even sort of bigger role with median earners maybe having to pay a little bit more tax to fund the sort of the universal resilient public services that the Scottish Government kind of hopes to deliver on. Awesome. So that's everything. Thanks for listening.
Juan Pedro, thank you very much. That was really interesting. We'll hold any questions just now until after Augustin's shared his presentation. I would say the reference to heroic assumptions did make me laugh, but and it's part of the political cycle, I suppose, in the presentation of the budget. But I think heroic assumptions is a will be a memorable phrase that I may use again in the future. But thank you. So now, Augustin, do you want to share our quick analysis of the sort of headline details from what it looks like for regeneration in the Scottish budget.
Thanks, Ewan, and thanks, Juan Pedro, as well. That was really interesting and helped set out the sort of wider context. Is this showing up all right for
It
everyone?
is, yes.
Great, excellent. So you may recognize this table from some of the blogs we posted and from the wider budget. So just to briefly cover how regeneration sits in the Scottish budget, you can see that it has fallen to around 35 million in the upcoming financial year. You can see in the financial transactions area that there's a potential for an outstanding Spruce loan repayment to bump that funding settlement up to 47 million. There's not a whole lot of detail on that in the budget itself, but even with that sort of potential, it still marks a pretty significant decrease in funding, which is obviously of concern. And we've heard from quite a few members of the Surf Network and people who are in receipt of funding about some of the impact that will have on communities and people on the ground. So the most significant of these and contributing to this overall fall in funding would be the Investing in Community Fund, which appears to be discontinued. I know that that's been on the forefront of a lot of people's minds. So just to outline that Surf did write to the Deputy First Minister on the day of the budget asking for clarification around that, specifically around what contingency or transitional support is available in the event that the ICF won't be replaced, or that there won't be an accompanying new fund. And the SCEO has published a joint letter just on Monday, gone there on the 26th, just highlighting again that same ask for clarification and setting out some of the concerns that communities are facing as a result of this. If we look at the sort of wider picture of regeneration in the spending review, it suggests that potential 47 million is the sort of new baseline for future years. It suggests a lower baseline, certainly in comparison to previous years, which obviously will affect regeneration capacity. It'll affect the work that community-led regeneration projects can deliver on the ground. So that is a worrying trend, and that's something that Surf is keen to address. And we given that the great work that's been done, not just through the ICF, but other regeneration funds, that's a real priority there. In terms of wider regeneration updates, just before we open for questions and comments, worth mentioning the vacant and derelict land fund will be absorbed by the RCGF. There's no clarity on the planned budget for that for the next year. But that's a watching space. That's something to be clarified in future. In terms of creative regeneration, which many of you will know is a key focus for Surf, and it's one of our Surf Award categories. There's some positive news in the significant uplift for Creative Scotland funding. So that's about a 20 million increase there. Most of you will know that obviously Creative Scotland is one of those areas where there is multi-year funding models and structures in place. So again, it's good to see that is expanding, but Surf, as we'll come on to in our manifesto discussion, would really like to see that rolled out more broadly across the sector. Just to briefly say as well, there's no detail specifically on the funding settlement for Clyde Gateway, which is part of a wider budget line. And in terms of the enterprise agency, there's been a slight increase for South of Scotland Enterprise and a decrease for Scottish Enterprise and Highlands and Islands Enterprise by respectively 4% and 29%. Worth bearing in mind that could vary year on year anyway, just because of the funding for specific projects and things like that. But hopefully that is a useful overview. Ewan, feel free to jump in if there's anything you want to add to that. But I wonder if we could move on to questions. Does that sound all right, Ewan?
Yep, that's great. So if you want to stop sharing your presentation, and we're happy to open the floor to any questions if you want to raise your hand or. We have a question in the chat from Robert McBean. Thanks, Robert. Juan Pedro, I don't know if you have any thoughts on this about whether or not there'll be any significant mid-year adjustment to the budget. I know that 2 years ago, I suppose, in thinking of what Augustin's just presented for the regeneration budget 2 years ago, it was a much lower figure than was anticipated because of things that happened mid-year, and that directly fed on to communities that benefited from specific funding. Do you anticipate that that might happen this year, or?
Yeah, I I've only kind of seen some of the sort of analysis other people have done, but I know the picture again looks quite tight and optimistic. My understanding is that the sort of pay increase assumptions in a lot of the sectors are below the already agreed union agreed um, increases with some of the in some professions. So yeah, I think it definitely looks yeah, challenging, and it could have implications for either mid-year adjustments or like next year's budget for sure. And yeah, I think obviously you know, pay is a huge proportion of day-to-day resources in a lot of the kind of in a lot of portfolios, particularly health and education. So, yeah, that's like a huge potential issue for sure.
Right. Okay. Thank you. I was talking to somebody who works in the cultural sector and for one of the large cultural organizations. I think they've been told that they are having um, increased, their proposed increase recognized, but I think that was for this year past. We've got a question, another one in the chat asking, comment on the fact that the DWP now includes Scottish Child Payment as an income source. Don't know if you have if that's something that you've looked at, Juan Pedro.
Is that for the purposes? I haven't heard if that's for the purposes of like benefit calculations. That would seem totally counterintuitive. Because in a way, the way Scottish Child Payment works is it gets applied to families who are on kind of a suite of UK government benefits, mainly universal credit. So if Scottish Child Payment gets used to um, like calculate like your universal credit kind of eligibility, that's like cyclical, and it kind of being a social security benefit, it probably like I don't think it should. It's meant to like supplement universal credit provision. But I haven't actually heard about this.
Okay. Going back to some of your comments at the end around looking at the sort of longer term forecast around raising income and changes to the tax system, do you, because obviously the gap is wide, uh, do you, what is the reality of actually being able to raise tax on the economy as it stands over the next 4 years to address that gap?
Yeah, I think as we say, there's there's a big fiscal challenge, but there's also a lot of space for reform of like devolved taxes. I think, for example, on local property taxes, council tax, not only is a poorly designed system, which is like very outdated and regressive, but it's also quite low as a share of local government revenue compared to other regions in the UK, other nations in the UK. So we think like there's potential there, and um, and on income tax, I think it is a reality that the Scottish government has already used like income tax to like a significant extent to raise additional funding. But I think I guess it's more a political question than a sort of economic or policy question, whether even more can be done. And we think that there's a need to be very frank about the implications of not doing that kind of additional thing. And I think yeah, the government has been basically increasing income tax indirectly through freezing thresholds year on year, except for like lower thresholds in the past couple of years. and like we think like that's fine, and that achieves some revenue increases. But if you need a level change in the level of revenue available to you, then you like freezing thresholds doesn't allow you to control to basically confirm that availability, that resource. So we think more needs to be done, and that might be something like a 1 percentage point increase across bands or to the lower bands, and a slightly higher increase to the higher bands. Um, I think like it could look like there's different ways of organizing it, and different tax revenue sources have like a bigger or a smaller capacity to raise additional funds. But we think like all options need to be explored.
I suppose on the property tax, I mean, in the past I've done work around land value tax, which seems like a permanent discussion, and I know it's been looked at again. But property tax, I'm presuming it's not something that the addressing of it wouldn't be happening within the next parliament. It would take the next parliament to actually address the issue, and to look at council tax. And so we're not going to see significant changes in revenue through property tax within the next 4 years. It would be beyond that if that was to be addressed by the Parliament. Would that be right?
Yeah, totally. But I think and that makes it even kind of more kind of angering that that reform hasn't like it's not already sort of through the like in the pipeline. And I think the Scottish government has had consultations about reforming council tax, had it in manifestos, and uh, in the end decided not to go ahead with further reform, claiming that there was no political consensus, despite a lot of other parties also calling for council tax reform. And yet, in this budget, for example, because we've seen those changes at the UK level, there's been like a small reform to council tax proposed, which is gonna lead to tax like bills been different, I think already like in 2 years' time, and that's gonna require a revaluation of those houses worth over £1 million. So it seems like a missed opportunity. If you're gonna do a revaluation, why not kind of be more ambitious and kind of integrate long-term thinking into it and make it a wholesale revaluation that could be the basis for could build the pillars for like future comprehensive council tax reform.
Hmm.
Yeah.
I
Yeah,
wonder, sorry, you, and I was just going to ask on that point, because I was looking over I don't know if you've had a look at the recent council tax consultation, Juan Pedro, but it's interesting that in the modeling assumptions, it sort of basically said that it would be cost neutral, so that that it wouldn't be a revenue raiser, which is interesting that you've talked about these levers that exist, but in this sort of ongoing modeling, we're looking at how do we actually keep that stagnant or keep that the same, and appreciate that's maybe one of the ways of making the reforms more palatable. But it also is interesting that it kind of cuts into the capacity of then raising revenue. I wonder if you've looked at that in the sense of actually removing some of those modeling assumptions and thinking, well, actually, if you were looking at it this way, how would that shape up, and how would the difference
Yeah,
be?
totally. Yeah, that's very much kind of the space we're in for this report that we're working on. So I think the analysis by the Institute of Fiscal Studies is like incredibly detailed and really useful. But they were sort of given a remit for analyzing a specific kind of design, and it is revenue neutral. I think from the perspective of the government, with the thinking that sort of it's already a contentious policy area. If there's any suspicion that is not only reform but also like a cash grab, then it's likely to face more opposition. We think because of the fiscal situation and because of like the long lead times for reform, both of the two issues need to be kind of addressed at once and can be addressed at once and can be part of a conversation about kind of the need for additional resources and for better taxes. And so, yeah, I think, for example, like in that consultation analysis document, One of the options, which is actually not included in the consultation questions, is a move to a proportional property tax that moves away from a band system and is sort of like arguably sort of better designed. And in those, if in that kind of tax, it's as easy as changing the rate, the percentage that you charge on property values. And we're looking at different kind of scenarios for that in our report.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting because I think that even within, the current proposals for some of the more progressive models, you do see that the actual the raw percentages are still much higher for lower income or lower value properties, and it's an interesting sort of discrepancy, which, as you say, if you're trying to really take a big progressive step, there's still some issues there.
Yeah.
We've got another couple of questions come in. Again, if you want to give your questions early, please feel free to put your hand up. Alex has asked, Fatima, I'll come back to yours. Alex has asked, is anyone looking at options for how to improve productivity across the sectors and join up dots for people to enable better outcomes? Which is a good question. I'm not sure if that's the thing that becomes apparent through the budget.
Yeah, it hasn't been part of uh, our kind of blog, budget reaction blog, but it has come up in the sort of wider analysis that we're doing for that report. So the Scottish Government's fiscal sustainability plan set out sort of like pillars for achieving fiscal sustainability, and one of them was public sector reform, which I think includes moving towards preventative spending and also provided more like join up support. Um, I think like 100% like better, more integrated services can be cost saving and service improving. I think like and if that leads to like efficiency savings, that could mean that could mean lower spend and lower taxes for everyone, and that would be great if we get better services paying less taxes. But we think when the issue with the approach taken in the budget, which sort of sets out this sort of goal for 1.5 billion of efficiency savings over the next 3 years, is that it's sort of it's set out from the outset rather than like as a result of like achieving these reforms and achieving these better outcomes. So there's a risk that if the outcomes don't materialize, you still have kind of less resources and therefore less public services.
I referred to this earlier to Juan Pedro, Alex, but Centre for Cities has produced some interesting research this week around the cities in the UK that have whose disposable income has increased, and the ones that seem to where there has been an increase in disposable income for communities are places where there's been investment in hyper local economies, and they tend to be kind of Midlands, north of England places, post-industrial. So actually, not the classic places that we think where all the money goes, London, or Edinburgh. And well, significantly, one of the things that internally the reporting of it, there is no Scottish cities where disposable income has increased over the same period. Um, and one of the points they're making is there is a huge amount of investment goes into mitigating poverty, and that some of that is maybe not, it's not resulting in differences, better outcomes for communities, which is really Centre for Cities is a kind of centre right, so they're very interesting analysis. But they often bear reading with that in mind. But nonetheless, there's something quite sort of interesting in there. But Fatima, you have asked why cuts to simple question: why cuts to communities and regeneration funding, but an increase for culture, and why this budget, given it's an election year? I suppose my observation on that would be the Creative Scotland funding increase has been flagged for quite some time with the CabSec over a year ago, with a major campaign from the cultural community demanding more money, and then this commitment to give a lot of money to the creative sector for Scotland, and comparing with international comparators. What I would observe around it is what's been interesting about this budget is yes, there's an increase, but if you look at but it's not an increase for the state-funded aspects of culture. So for all the state performing organizations, they are all now saying that they are facing something really drastic. So for the National Theatre of Scotland, the Royal Scottish National Orchestra, etc., etc., are all saying they are not receiving any of that money. So that money is going potentially in a community direction around culture and creativity. Is it enough? It won't be, and it won't mitigate what is a reduction in the community and regeneration funding, I would say, which is why understanding what's going to happen at the end of the Investing Communities Fund becomes particularly crucial, because there is new funding available through communities, and a lot of the funding that seems to be available in the budget is targeting child poverty. No one wants to not target child poverty, but we know that the Investing Communities Fund possibly is supporting up to about 250 to 300,000 people in Scotland, in communities that are experiencing deprivation. And so, as much as it's going to impact the ending of the fund, it impacts on organisations. It's the impact on the communities that have been receiving that. And I suppose what it then flags up more is project funding services that are addressing poverty is not a good way of addressing poverty, because they are cyclical, and they come to an end, which is, we will maybe talk a bit more about when we talk a bit about what our asks for are the manifesto, particularly in relation to fair funding. Does anyone else have any other questions on the outcome of the Scottish budget? Not seeing any hands, nothing in the chat I've missed. No.
Ewan, sorry,
yes.
it's Alex back again.
Hi, Alex.
Hi there. I was just going to ask whether anyone had noticed the £30 million announced in December 24 for I think it was Invest to Save fund. And this was Shona Robertson saying there will be public service reform, there will be a fund. And when she announced it, she said the fund would be had to be spent in 25-26. And after that, there wasn't really anything public. There were a number of FOI requests to try and elicit more information. And it turned out that there were about 41 internal bids to Miss Robertson for her 30 million, mostly, well, I think all public sector. And they varied from paying for redundancy to doing this, that, and other. And they didn't necessarily seem to be joined up or focused on public service reform. I just wonder whether anyone had heard of it, because we're now at the end of 25-26 and nobody really knows if the money has gone or where it's gone or what it has achieved.
Juan Pedro, do you know anything about that? It's new to me.
Yeah, no, I haven't. I'll just say on a very general, like a general level, I think like there is a point about sort of public sector reform is difficult to do because it involves changes to portfolio, like inter-portfolio funding that are hard to bring into a budget. So for example, like do you give less money to social security and give more money to regeneration if you don't know like if the outcomes are going to show up and so on. So I think I totally get that, and I think like therefore doing it like little by little, for example, through how you allocate additional funding rather than like the bulk of funding, or through things like this, which are like small pilot projects, I think have some merit. But obviously, you expect those things to scale up over time, and there needs to be an understanding of what public sector reforms actually means, and obviously paying for redundancies or anything of that sort is not actually public sector reform. So if that's the case, then it sounds like a missed opportunity.
Thanks very much, and thanks, Alex. I will have a look into that later to see if there's any more information about it. And thanks for sharing something in the chat in relation to. I mean, it's interesting. I suppose last year one of my questions around how does funding decisions made, because obviously there was and I like culture and arts. I have to caveat by saying this, but the announcement that the Donard Centre in the centre of Edinburgh was being, excuse me, was being allocated more government funding for the completion of a home for the Scottish Chamber Orchestra. It was, I can't remember if it was 10 or 20 million that was found, but it's unclear where that budget is coming from. And the fact that you can find within a fiscal year, you can find that level of money to fund something when there are communities delivering projects that are addressing poverty, and we have food banks, pantries, etc. I find a very difficult pill to swallow. So the decision of government to fund certain things when they have a target on child poverty, it is a serious target. Are we taking that really seriously when we can choose to fund something, which I know are important things and in some senses can have good outcomes, but when we see real emergencies happening within our communities and on our streets with our neighbours, it can be difficult to look at. But also I would also agree with Juan Pedro, the complexity of government and looking at systems change across government and it being kind of coherent from the outside. And obviously from having lots of friends on the inside of Scottish Government, it seems particularly challenging to do things that are resulting in proper efficiencies and that are joined up. And I think the challenge that we had, that was at a public health meeting at Public Health Scotland last week, and looking at the increasing demand on the health system that is forecast for the next 15 years, which has to be met, but also we have a big desire for preventative spend. And we have to do both. We can't, and because there's often a lot of people saying, if you give us some money, we will prevent something happening. But that prevention will happen in the distant future. You can't take away money from the acute front that a lot of the health service is facing, which reflects things around our economy, but also around the demographics of us as a Western nation as well. So there are really difficult decisions to be made around there. But if there's no more questions, I would thank you everyone for the questions that you've shared with us today. And Juan Pedro, thank you very much for the time that you have given us this morning. It was really interesting to have a wider overview to put what's happening within Regeneration within context. And we maybe look forward to hearing more work from Future Economy Scotland. It's really interesting to have that analysis. And we'll take this opportunity to have a quick break, and we'll maybe just come back into the room at, let's say, 11:05. Welcome back, everybody. Thank you to those who have stayed on the call. I suppose just thinking about the discussion, if you could hold on a second, that's my postman. Working from home, the joys. One of the interesting things about the Scottish budget is the initial publication of the Scottish budget is very high level, and a lot of our interests are in the details of what it's going to mean, and they remain unknowns for weeks. And the budget remains, I suppose, draft budget until the Scottish Parliament signs it off next month in February for the next year. But it always takes time. But it is frustrating, and even when the budget is initially published, I suppose there are documents where you read the high level things, and then ultimately there's level 4, which is a spreadsheet, and sort of analysing all that. The presentation and the transparency of it all is never as easy as we would like it. But it does mean that we all sit in a period of limbo where it's very frustrating not knowing exactly what the consequences are going to be. And because of the delay in the UK budget, which delayed the Scottish budget, it means knowing the budget for next year for a lot of us becomes an even more kind of tense experience for reasons that are out with everyone's control. So one of the reasons we thought it would be helpful to hear somebody talking about the budget in the wider context. But now we're going to have a look at what SURF have been doing around our manifesto and what we're looking at the next Scottish Parliament are asked for this Parliament to deliver over the next 4 years after the election in May, one of the most exciting elections we've probably had in a long time, and exciting in a neutral way. But Augustine, I don't know if you want to share the presentation that we have, and what we're going to do now is Augustine and I are just going to run through it together. I'll talk a bit about the genesis of the manifesto, and then we'll look at some of the high-level asks that we're making within the manifesto.
Is that showing up?
That is showing up, yes.
Excellent. Over to you.
Thanks very much. So if you want to go to the next slide. So we're looking at empowering people, places and policy, which I suppose goes to the heart of what SURF is interested in. And we're looking at communities being in control of what happens, whether or not they are in ownership of what is around them, but communities being at the actual heart of what happens in a place, and the decision making, the allocation of resource, how things are managed, and the differences that can be made within local communities by good decision making. And so I think we talked about this at our meeting in July, and that the 4 policy priorities that we had concluded that we were going to explore how these could be delivered within the next Parliament. And the reason that we looked at these 4 policy areas was because Augustine predecessor, Derek, had done a series of interviews along with me of a wide number of stakeholders within the SURF network, and done some sense checking with people who attended a number of events that SURF held. And while SURF's interests are incredibly broad, because obviously what happens in a community, all sorts of things happen within communities, and we're interested in the holistic approach to place, where it's not just physical change that is going to improve people's lives, but there are all sorts of other aspects around the use of arts and creativity and culture, and looking at employment possibilities for people within communities as well. But what became apparent that in the interviews that we were doing was that there were underlying things that were affecting all places, sometimes to different degrees, but that were fairly universal, and that were driving bad decision making, or meaning that people were dealing with crises that were beyond their remit, and the people who were working either in employability or within arts and culture were still having to deal with other things that were not germane to employability or arts and culture, but were affecting people's ability to participate in those things, to participate in the workplace, or to enjoy the full aspect that creativity can bring to your life. And so we began narrowing it down, rather than doing a manifesto that asked for absolutely everything. And obviously our interests are, as I've said, are broad, and we could have asked for absolutely everything under the sun. But we decided we would narrow it down to some kind of 4 fundamental areas that we thought that these were kind of crucial to ensuring that other things could be delivered. So if the area of interest that you work in is not directly reflected within our 4 policy priorities, it's not because we don't think it's an important thing, but it's because we think that there are fundamental things that need to be there to meet basic human needs, and to make sure that communities are at the heart of addressing those needs, so that other things those other good things can also be delivered, and that communities can benefit from those. So the areas that we began looking at were local democracy, so people being in the decision-making seat, the delivering affordable housing, the housing crisis / emergency being something that was making it very difficult for people to deliver other things that people benefited from when people were not in housing, or had inadequate housing, or were under increased housing pressure through the affordability of it. Public transport was one that came across everywhere, and public transport and connectivity across the board was an issue, where particularly around employability, people's ability to get to a place of work being hampered by poor transport connections. And I suppose my sort of initial reflection on the public transport thing is, we know that I think the Green Party are looking at increasing the offer of free bus travel, which we know 2 groups within Scotland benefit from. But I suppose one of the challenges with that is in providing that as a resource, does it provide increased bus services? Because we know that post-COVID there's been a reduction in bus services. So we think that's driving a lot of challenges around communities in moving around and accessing services and accessing employment. And committing to fair funding, as we've just been discussing, across all our interests and all the stakeholders that we've spoken to, the kind of cyclical nature of the funding, the fairly short-term 1 to 3 year limit that goes on funding, is also meaning that the preventative spend thing is really not able to happen because people can't plan long term for their organizations or for their communities. And it means that people who work in delivering services around communities who are in need are part of the precariat themselves. And so you're kind of compounding the stress that is being experienced across various sectors within that. So we thought that these were 4 fundamental, and I suppose it's going back to, things like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. There are other things that are necessary for a good cohesive community, but we felt that these are kind of 4 kind of crucial things at the base of it that really need to be addressed within the next Parliament. Unlikely to be solved within the next Parliament, but the next Parliament has to address them really significantly if we are going to address some of the most significant things around poverty. Do you want to go to the next slide? So one of the first, we're not putting these in a hierarchical way. However, given the sort of strapline as communities being in the sort of control seat, resourcing local democracy was one that we thought was crucial in the Parliament addressing. Democracy Matters has been rumbling on for a number of years. We think there's still something maybe due to come out, maybe within the next couple of months, another blueprint that looks at what the government is, where the government is going to take that. But we think that that is a crucial element of what the next Parliament has to address. And I suppose I'm maybe speaking from a personal position, but in a lot of the work that we do and the people that we speak to, looking at kind of the role of community councils within communities. And community councils is a statutory. It exists within legislation, but they just must exist. They have a very light framework around them, and it's never been an area of democracy or a strand or strata of democracy that has been fully invested in and given power or given finance. And we think that rather than kind of reinventing the wheel, there is something there that can be used. Currently, it maybe runs unsatisfactorily and inconsistently across the country, but there is something there. These are people who are volunteering and putting time into it. But the fact that there isn't investment in community councils at present, and they don't have a significant amount of power, means there maybe is a lack of interest in them. But if more investment was put in them, then they would evolve into something that is more crucial to communities, and that is worth investing in that. And we've put the community action plan fund in, as local place plans have kind of have become this desirable thing to have. It's a plan, but they maybe should be part of something wider. And community action plans tend to be a much more kind of cohesive, wider, holistic document that look at what communities want to deliver, more than just around spatial elements within their community, which local place plans may have a focus on, but really delivering something. And as part of that, I suppose we've also mentioned that we need a network of community-led development officers, which would tie into that. In delivering community change, you need to have people dedicated there to do that. And I suppose surf through our Alliance for Action and our other partners, Cora, etc., Foundation Scotland, all who have funded people who work in communities whose only agenda is to help the community deliver its own aspirations, is vitally important, particularly in communities that are experiencing social and economic deprivation. Somebody has to be paid to do that, not for somebody else, but for the sake of the community. So we think that that's a kind of crucial. And we've just, for the sake of this morning, we're just choosing kind of 3 priorities within the manifesto itself that are a longer list of priorities that we would hope to see the next Parliament addressing. And as part of local democracy, we think the community wealth building agenda needs to go faster. and be more community focused. The challenge with the community wealth building agenda at present is it's a great in concept, and it has come in kind of at quite a high level, but it needs to be grassroots level driven. And as the bill passes through Parliament, then it's important that it becomes kind of more community-driven aspect to it as well. So that's a quick summary of why we think resourcing local democracy is a vital element of the next Parliament to address. Augustine, over to you.
And I'm on mute. Okay, thanks, Ewan. Taking housing next, as Ewan mentioned, one of those sort of really cross-cutting themes which came up time and time again through the consultation phase. Our focus here is really on social housing in particular, affordable housing also, but really focusing on social housing and the underlying principle being that completions in that space must essentially increase. But I think our wider discussion and treatment of housing is also around how housing assets are used within communities, how they're framed within communities, which needs, and sometimes these are competing needs, should be prioritized, and who has essentially say over that, and that links to the point that Ewan just mentioned around local democracy and input from communities. So our first priority is one that you may have seen around other manifestos. It's based on a piece of joint research commissioned by SFHA, CIH, and Shelter Scotland. It's around delivering the 15,693 social and affordable homes per year target, and the accompanying investment that requires. And it's important to note here that has emerged from a modeling exercise that they've undertaken that takes into consideration not just the houses that have been built over the previous years, but also the emerging need. And we know that the emerging need is also adding significant pressures to the housing system. So these are sort of updated figures which do paint a fairly urgent picture about the need for many more homes than is currently being planned as part of the affordable housing supply program in the recently announced Scottish budget. So the figures and the numbers mentioned in that number one priority are much higher than is currently planned also over the period of the spending review. And so that's sort of the main focus in terms of targets is outlined in that first priority. That being said, we don't want to be operating in a space where we're just focused on units and targets and hitting that. We are really strongly believe in embedding the Living Well Local principle of MPF4 within the design and delivery of housing. That needs to be appropriately resourced, and I know that there's calls from across the sector that it doesn't always happen, and that it therefore leads to decisions around funding and delivery which are not always ideal for communities. So new homes, they need to be connected to existing communities. They need to be connected to public transport, which we'll come on to. So again, there's strong linkages there. And fundamentally, this second point is about framing the first point around targets in the context of building communities and not just houses, which in the past, we can see that hasn't always happened in the past in various periods in built environment history. The third point links again strongly, and as you mentioned, there's quite a lot of other points within the manifesto which I recommend you to go through. I'll fire through those quickly at the end, but the third point is around empowering local communities to introduce short-term let registrations, cap or freeze in their area. So some of you may be aware that this currently already is happening in some way, shape or form across Scotland. So Edinburgh has some not around freezes or caps, but Edinburgh has some policies around that. Highland is doing things around control zones. Currently, a lot of that is being funneled in through planning, which places a lot of the burden not just on planning departments, but it also puts the emphasis on local authorities to complete that engagement exercise with communities. Essentially, this point is around acknowledging that there will be areas within Scotland where the over provision or the poor provision of housing versus holiday accommodation places pressure on local housing systems. And we do feel strongly that communities should have a mechanism in place to be able to say when that's the case and to be able to take some ownership about how they feel the balance should be struck. That not only helps to inform local authority policies around this, but also helps to empower them. So at the moment, we have some legislation around short-term legislations. This would be like an additional step to sort of take that forward. It would require new legislation to allow local authorities to implement those caps. And again, that could work in tandem with control zones. So it just means that there would maybe be a cap that then informs how many applications are then taken forward to planning, which again helps alleviate some of the pressures within the system. As you mentioned, community councils are a body that are well placed to be able to do that. It's a good example of where we think community councils can play a good role if resourced properly to do so. Just very briefly covering some of the other things that are in the manifesto, which we do recommend if you're interested to have a look at online. We've got stuff around funding right-sizing initiatives to make better use of social stock, things like funding town centre living, buyback and acquisition schemes. We have points around introducing a statutory definition of affordable housing, which we think would greatly benefit that wider discussion. A really important point about investing in supporting community-led housing, which, in some areas, either public sector provision or commercial provision, there's gaps, there's market failure, and that's where community-led housing can play a really important role. And also it's owned and led by communities, which leads to that, local democracy point. And planning flexibilities, and especially in areas where it can be restrictive and difficult. So again, there's lots there. I'll pass back over to Ewan.
Just yes, do pass back to me. But I suppose just before you do, I suppose on the housing element, I suppose one of the reasons is that I know, Paul, when you've commented around the planning design element as part of it is crucial. And I suppose this community, this network, this element of SURF's work began as the 20-minute neighbourhood network. And has broadened out, but I suppose that remains at the core of what our interests are: is making that places are well designed and that services all exist within a space. And the design is core to that, and it's the challenge around the housing emergency. I suppose there's a BBC article this morning on house costs or private rent costs in Scotland, and over 15 years, both in Edinburgh and Glasgow, private rent has gone up 100%. Over 15 years. And so it's looking at the kind of the dramatic change within housing, which has been driven by a shortage of housing. And it becomes this really tense thing of we really desperately need more housing because the lack of it is driving all sorts of bad consequences for individuals and for communities as a whole. But making sure that we say we need more housing, but we need it really well placed, well connected, well serviced, is in keeping that at the forefront of the demand and addressing the crisis/emergency is really, really important. But on our third point, committing to fair funding, it's a no-brainer. SCVO have been leading on this, obviously, and we're dependent on a huge number of organisations doing research around this, which Augustine will come into probably at the end. But we know that the short-term funding drives all sorts of behaviours. So we are looking at 5-year funding models being an ambition, with a look at core funding rather than just project-based funding. And we're also looking at a 10-year place-based regeneration funding programme for 10 place. Slightly arbitrary, but kind of to look at that. There are communities in Scotland or locations in Scotland who have had long-term funding, but it's not that there's been a 10-year commitment to it. It's been they have had to funding for 10 years, but it's making sure that we make decisions about where are the places that we really need to fund the most, and the communities that would most benefit from that holistic approach to funding to improve their local economies, and committing to that in the long term. I know that's difficult when you're looking at that's more than one cycle of a parliament, but nonetheless, other places manage to make those kind of long-term commitments. And we have had a government for 20 years. So kind of giving that commitment to a longer term approach to place, we think would also make a big difference to the outcomes that we're hoping to get from that investment. We're also looking at the streamlining and simplifying of grant processes every year when we do the analysis or the shared learning from the SURF Award nominees and winners. The kind of cocktail of funding aspect always is a big barrier for communities. For some people, it's just an accepted that's the nature of how things should be done. But there needs to be a kind of maybe a more coherent approach from a collection of funders to look at how, if they're all agreed that places need funding, how organisations within that place access that funding in a simpler way. COVID, we know that all funders kind of changed their patterns and things became a lot simpler. I'm not asking for that to happen exactly again, but it shows that there can be decision-making processes that can take place that are more coherent, and that then the reporting mechanisms for communities or for projects become simpler, and they're doing one report that satisfies a number of funders. And most communities don't care where the money comes from, whether it comes from Scottish Government, UK Government, philanthropic funders, charity, lottery. I'm not saying all communities don't care, but most communities don't really care where the funding comes from. But making sure that that's a kind of simpler approach would be highly desirable. But the Fair Funding SEVO have done some really good work on it. We know that the Scottish Government have piloted some 2-year funding models last year. There's no mention of it in the budget this year, but we know that there are agencies such as Creative Scotland and Historic Environment Scotland, their funding can be at least 3-year based for organisations, always with a caveat that things may change within that 3-year period. But nonetheless, that 3-year commitment kind of gives organisations a level of stability to be able to plan sort of longer term, which means the outcomes are better. I will hand back to you, Augustine.
Thank you. So moving on to the final priority, which is investing in public transport. Really don't want to sort of overwhelm with statistics, but I think there's a couple here which like are quite indicative of the situation in terms of transport, who's disadvantaged by it, and what that means for inequalities. So, I think these two statistics around people on lower incomes being 18 times more likely to take the bus, which over the years has become less affordable. We know that the price increases have been inflation busting. They've become less reliable and less frequent, as Ewan mentioned. So it's just a sort of piecemeal degradation of a mode of transport which those in poverty or those on lower incomes rely on, and that's concerning, and that's where we specifically hope that we should be channeling more funding and policy attention. And that also, that second statistic around bus journeys accounting for almost 3/4 of all public transport journeys a couple of years back, again shows that this inequality and this inequity within transport modes is not something that that should make sense. A lot of this will be down to how commercial operators function, how the wider transport system is integrated. So that's also where some of our priorities come into place. But ultimately, while it's encouraging, for example, to see that rail travel has seen some affordability measures taken around peak fares, ultimately that's not probably going to address, or we know that that's not going to address transport poverty, which we now also know is a wider, quite prevalent driver of wider poverty. So there's a lot to be done and achieved here. And our first priority is sort of that general point around embedding the principle around funding public and not private transport throughout transport policy. And that seems like a fairly straightforward and easy assumption, but if you actually take that through, it would lead to significantly different decisions taken around, for example, whether you decide to fund loans for EVs or whether you decide to put money into bus infrastructure or bus transport, or putting more policy priority into franchising and things like that. So that is an overarching principle which we think is fundamental and which we think isn't fully realized. The second point is around supporting local authorities with ambitions to municipalize buses or explore franchising models, with obviously that full municipalized model being advantageous, being the sort of gold standard, but franchising offering also great opportunities there. We know that those conversations in Glasgow have been ongoing for quite a long time. So it'd be really good to see that situation move forward. And we know from, for example, the Edinburgh case study that there are real benefits to these models and ways of addressing transport inequality. And, that's reflected in other examples across the UK, such as in Manchester. So, we think that this, far from being a sort of ideological point, it's a way to really help address transport inequalities and inefficiencies, to take some, public ownership of what is a really important public service. And that third point is around just a broader move to investing in bus services, bus infrastructure, and community transport. Very similar to the point around community-led housing. There will be areas where, and there are a lot of areas in a country that is as rural and as sort of geographically diverse as Scotland, where there aren't any commercial operators, or where there aren't public operators, or where the financial incentives don't exist for either of those to exist fully. And that's where we see, community transport really playing a leading role. And, for example, in franchising models, it's really important that those are integrated. And when it comes to bus infrastructure, again, that's an investment that can happen really usefully at the national scale. And we have seen in the recent budget, I think bus infrastructure fund is within the active travel budget line. So we know that there's been an increase in the active travel budget line, quite significant one. I think it's 66%, but we don't yet know, as Ewan mentioned, whether that filters down into like the bus infrastructure fund specifically. But if it was, that would be really welcome, and that's something that SURF think could use a lot of investment, because there's a lot that's covered within that and a lot of innovation that can happen that isn't happening just now. Just brought very quickly some other points around transport, again, which are on our manifesto website and the downloadable document that's hosted there. We know there's strong interplay between digital exclusion, connectivity, and public transport. That's something that came up in the consultation event. So we also have a point around digital inclusion, addressing those connectivity issues, which again, we know there's obviously a huge overlap sometimes. So areas which are facing transport connectivity issues will also sometimes face digital exclusion, or won't have the right support when it comes to broadband issues, which again, that's really important to address those things in tandem and to consider them as part of the same wider connectivity point. As I mentioned, the point about bus infrastructure fund is important. We mentioned points about regulatory options to address escalating bus fares, and also implementing recommendations from previous Mind the Gap reports around improving participation, equity, access within the transport system. So, we know that the transport system can feel like this very mechanical entity, this very sort of systems-based way of thinking, but it is about people. It is about equity. It is about people participating within it and having a transport system that reflects needs across different communities. And that's obviously, pivotal as well. So just briefly before we finish up, we've highlighted a couple of organizations listed here in the diagram, who we feel have really strong synergies with the work that we've outlined, many of which have done much of the legwork around these policy areas. So we're by no means trying to reinvent the wheel. But for example, SCVO around fair funding, or the research I alluded to around SFHA, many of these have manifestos already out, which would be, if you're interested in learning more about those specific areas, do have a look. Not all of them will have them published, but we'll be updating the links. And it's also just to say that, as you had mentioned, our interests are very broad. Because of our focus on these 4 areas, we can't expand and include everyone on this diagram as much as we would like, but we are hoping to put together a page of manifestos with shared interests across the SURF network, with other manifestos that we recommend people read and that we think people should support. And hopefully they can act as a nice repository of shared policy interests and can influence the advocacy process moving forward. So do get in touch, and we'll be working on that list as and when everyone publishes their manifestos. And yeah, I think we will leave it there, Ewan. I hope you're doing all right for time. I'll just stop sharing the screen.
Thank you.
In the chat, but I'm seeing a lot of
There's
messages.
a lot of chat comment and some questions, and I suppose I'm going to ask. I have messaged some people who have asked questions to say, could they ask them orally? Tracy, you've asked a question. Rather than just hearing us speak, and would you be willing to ask your question to the room?
Hi, can everybody see me?
Thanks very much, Tracy.
Hi there. So I am a regen coordinator with Wheatley Group, but I am also a town planner. So I was quite interested, obviously, in your comments around placemaking, design, affordable housing, and that thing. So my question was really in respect of NPF 4, and whether you thought maybe there were any kind of glaring points in terms of the policy requirements to provide energy efficient, sustainable housing that's well designed and also that is in accordance with the 20-minute neighbourhood. So whether there were any kind of ways the NPF 4 could be stronger in order to align with what SURF are thinking?
I suppose it's not that. Let's see, how do I answer that question? Because obviously we did quite a lot of work in 20-minute neighbourhoods as SURF, and it's something that I have spoken a lot about, and I'm speaking at Heriot-Watt University students about 20-minute neighbourhoods next month. I could simply answer, say, yes, the policy is there. It's about the delivery of the policy, the consistent delivery of the policy. And I think one of the interesting things about 20-minute neighbourhoods, aside from some of the controversies that seem to be arising again around it being this kind of imprisoning thing, even though the first thing about a 20-minute neighbourhood is there a bus that will take you away to other places, not away to prison? But one of the interesting things about it is in seeing its use by local council, in seeing planners talk about 20-minute neighbourhoods and saying this is a 20-minute neighbourhood, and lay people saying that doesn't look like a 20-minute neighbourhood to me, in that not all the services are here, it's just a housing development and it has a bus stop. People can identify what is not a traditional livable neighbourhood. And so I suppose what we want to see is the consistent delivery of those places. So places that are well connected, that are walkable, that are energy efficient, but that also come with the needed services, be that around health and education, are also stitched in from the start, and that we're not, because of the housing need has impacts for schooling and education and health demands and retail. And we know that there are large developments that are created that aren't big enough for retail demand yet, so they don't have retail, so everyone has to drive. It's a chicken and egg thing, but and there's something around that that's really difficult. On the 20-minute neighbourhood sort of policy agenda and what it says in NPF 4, it just says you have to have retail. Could that be better? It should be affordable retail, and it should be affordable food, fundamentally, is the necessary thing that you're really looking at. So yes, there are things around NPF 4 that could be strengthened, but it's more the consistent delivery of it rather than some low density volume housing areas, which we have seen continue to be delivered. Not everywhere, but in some places, and particularly places where there's high pressure for housing demand. So it's making sure that is intrinsically part of the decision making. And I suppose we're very interested in what's happening within cities and town centres and the addressing housing within that. And I know somebody else commented on the affordability thing, and that's why we are majoring on social housing and affordable housing, not housing. That public money should be supporting social housing and affordable housing, because particularly the social housing element, to make sure people who are in the most vulnerable groups, who are currently in the private rented sector, which is the place we're seeing the most stress around increased costs, which will not change, which will probably accelerate as other sustainability demands and higher standards are put on that part of the housing market. It's making sure that those people are catered for as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just to add briefly, Tracy, while Ewan looks for the next question, if he hasn't already done so. But I think the other point is, as Ewan said, there's points where it could be strengthened or the emphasis could be clarified, but it's as much a matter of resource. And I think that's the thing right now, which we're not seeing so much, is that, we're talking about targets, we're talking about, we're almost having a discussion about the targets, and people aren't in agreement about what they should be and how they should be addressed and what the funding should be for those. So that there's then also the added difficulty of like, well, how do you then add resource to actually integrate that thinking within living well locally, and what does that cost? Because the costs aren't negligible to design in that way. It's not cost neutral. So I think that's a wider consideration and a wider issue, that's why we've added
very
resource.
difficult.
Yeah.
NPF4 is taking the whole of Scotland into consideration. So writing policy that can adequately cover every kind of different scenario, particularly when we're looking at rural areas where achieving these kind of things is incredibly difficult. But NPF4 has kind of bed in, and there are particularly some concerns around the kind of other aspects of the policy, looking at surface water and flooding and things like that. So it is something that will get reviewed, and just interested to hear if CERF would be making comments as and when the next NPF5 comes into iteration.
We would always be making comment on stuff around spatial planning and how it affects communities who are experiencing poverty. And I think the increased demands and cost, the cost of construction and the cost of infrastructure are continually going up. And there are consequences to that. And I suppose going back to the 20-minute neighborhood, my feeling was that 20-minute neighborhoods was always, it's not cheap. It will not be the cheapest option to do a 20-minute neighborhood, but it will be the preventative option, and it will be cheaper in the long run. But in our current sort of economic system, that's quite a difficult argument to make, because you will not see the benefit. You will not understand the true health benefits, maybe for 10 to 20 years as a generation goes through living in a place, and we see the long-term benefits of that. So yes, but it's also making sure that
The
planners and councillors have the confidence to make decisions to say, to push where possible within the fiscal restraints that we have just heard in the first half of this morning.
Brilliant. Thank you so much.
Now, there was another question around community councils from somebody in Girvan. I'm having to scroll back up, and I wanted them to come into the space to ask it.
It was for me, Alan.
Yes,
James.
it was you, Alan. Yes, there you go.
Yes. Our community council are doing really good work, not only directly making changes, but they're bringing other groups, local community groups together, and obviously working in a joined up way. What sort of help and empowerment do you see that would benefit community councils that could be brought in?
What sort of budget are you working with? So, Alan, we should say you're from Girvan, and obviously we have a colleague in Girvan, so we know about the great work that's happening in Girvan. But so, what sort of budget do you have to work with, Alan?
Well, I'm not in the community council. I'm one of the projects, and it's just new, so we're just funding at the moment. But the community council have been great in facilitating other organisations I work with, and getting them all together and really cooperating rather than just ad hoc, which has made a big difference. But I just wonder what you were talking about, doing things to help community councils or getting the government to do. what in specifically were you talking about?
I suppose making sure that community councils have budgets that they can do something with, so that they can do the sort of work that your community council is doing, because sometimes they work with a couple of hundred quid, and particularly around community consultation, it doesn't happen for free, and being able to continually know what your community's needs are. So there's financial resource that we think would make a difference to them, but also the kind of role that community councils play. Community councils often within the agreements that they have with local authorities may have very limited powers in terms of what they are consulted on. It might just be planning matters. And there's more than planning matters that they could operate on according to the legislation, because they are able to do anything if there's an agreement with the local authorities to do that. So we think that there is an opportunity for them to be involved in wider decision making, and making sure they have a seat at the table around the community planning partnership, and that their interests, that they do actively reflect the interests of the community. So there are really good community councils that are already doing good things. They're often in places which where people have the individual resource and expertise to do that. And there are other parts of Scotland where there is an absence of community councils. And I suppose one of the comments that's often made around community councils is, although it's an elective process, it's very rare that there is an elective process, because there may not be as many people standing for the places as there are. And that maybe reflects the fact that it's not seen as a true decision-making part of the community, and that if there was greater powers given to community councils, or that they were more than just, I suppose, particularly in planning matters, that their opinions were considered. And I suppose what Augustine referred to, the role that community councils could play in understanding the role of short-term lets within a community and things like that, may make it more appealing to more people to apply for community councils, so that it becomes seen to be a properly democratic part of the whole democratic system. So these are just a couple of things that we think would make a difference. And we know that there is work undergoing on looking at improving local democracy, along with development trusts and other democratically formed community bodies. But because community councils exist across Scotland, we think it's important that we really build on an existing piece of democratic kit that's there. We've got two hands up, Kath and then Mick.
Hi, I'm also from Garvan. So I'm the development officer for Go Garvan, which is a SCIO and now a development trust. And I'm also a community councillor. So I can confirm that we run on about 600 quid a year. However, we have been trying to build relationships, not just with the community, and as Alan was saying, getting groups together, but also with individual departments within the council, and sort of building up. You're right, it starts with planning for some reason. I think it's something to do with playgrounds and toilets, but trying to build those relationships with various departments. We're now with parks and cemeteries as well. It's all a bit strange, but do you see any way of, as you build those relationships and kind of gain the trust of the different council departments, that there's a way to kind of squeeze yourself in for a bit more of a say, a bit more sort of devolved power back to the community, and then try and structure it, like bake it in? How would you see us moving from this, we're really nice people and we won't bite you, to
Yes.
How do we bake this in and make it, a signed document that we have this level of commitment and communication?
Well, before I answer that, I want to bring Mick in, because Mick's from SEDC and I know they're involved in some work around this, and see if he has an answer to that as well before I say anything. Mick?
Well, I don't have the answer to it.
An answer.
I would hesitate to say it, but what I would say is, you mentioned yourself about the local governance review, and I do think that for people who remember the local governance review and Democracy Matters 1 and 2, it is kind of motoring on in the background, and I think there's been quite a lot of progress over the period since the end of the last formal consultation, and what might happen next in this blueprint that the government are working on for sharing more power with communities. And certainly there is a fair amount of emphasis on the role of community-led organisations, including but not limited to community councils, acting together as a sort of umbrella group within areas to work to produce a kind of a clear statement about local needs and desires and aspirations, and then work with public agencies to see resources devolved to meet some of that. So there's a lot of positive noises being made around that have come out of the consultation. Of course, the sort of devil's in the detail, but I suppose what I would say is that I think the kind of stuff I've seen in the draft blueprints, because we are members of the steering group for this work, we have seen the draft blueprint, so we'll have DTAS and Scottish Community Alliance as the three organisations that are probably closest to community organisations like yourselves. But we're not at liberty as yet to share the detail, although I think that will be shared quite soon. So I think there is more coming down the line that will be encouraging. I think it may be that there'll be legislation, either to build on the existing duties of locality planning, or hopefully to bring a new kind of statutory power to more community-led processes like community-led action plans. But it's not certain as yet as to which it will be. So there are things happening, and part of that is looking at how communities might have more direct access to influencing decisions, influencing spending, and also having a bit more direct influence over money itself. So this is probably as much as I can say at the moment. What I would say about the community development support is that in our view, there's a sort of national crisis in community development support. Communities generally don't have access to local, trusted, good quality community development support. And I think we see support to community councils in that context. So it may be that the best way to go is to look at community development support for areas, including the work of community councils, rather than something specific for community councils, because each area is different. And a lot of that support, I think, is about building relationships between groups and organisations, so that maximising the solidarity that can produce the greatest leverage. So I'll leave it there, Alan. Sorry, you, unless anybody wants to come back to me.
So
Mick, that's really helpful. One of the things, Kath, I've put in the chat is SADC's previous work on strengthening community councils, which has some really great recommendations. It's from a few years ago, but nonetheless they remain valid. And I think Alan has given a good. Mick has given. You used the word name Alan, so I'm now saying Alan. I know we heard from Alan earlier, but Mick's given some helpful comments there. Augustine, were you about to come in there?
yeah, I was just going to say, Mick, that is what you described at the end there is pretty much exactly one of the asks there around that community-led local sort of development function, which we know exists in some councils, and I think it varies significantly. For some of that's funded out of other budgets, for example. I don't think we're necessarily saying that has to exist within the council, but that sort of that role that plays that crucial role, and having it funded moreover, because right now so that's an easy area where we think funding and support could go into. Again, the community action plans is another concrete area of funding and support, Alan, which links to your question. But then what Ewan also referred to is, we don't have community councils everywhere. And Scottish Government have previously sort of hinted at this link between deprivation and community councils disappearing. We don't really understand that fully, but that's a concerning link. It's one that, again, we would like, we mention explicitly funding to go back into reestablishing and supporting those areas that currently don't have that local democratic framework. So those are really easy things that you can do even before the local government's sort of review is completed and more systemic changes take place. You and I'll pass back to you.
If I could just say that, I think you're dead right there, and I think that the lack of investment in that democratic process has been around for a long time. I'll not name the authority, but we did a significant review of community council scheme of establishment in the local authority a few years back, and as part of that, because there were a lot of suggestions about how to maybe make it easier for elections to take place, there was a bit of a panic because it became clear that the local authority no longer made provision to fund elections. And that so tells you a lot about their expectations of what was happening there. And it was obviously quite worrying. I'm not saying that happens everywhere, but it was the case. Just another point while I'm on, in terms of Chris Woodness's point around local place plans and community action plans, we see these two as really inextricably linked, and it's a shame Nick Wright's left the call, because I think he's done some really groundbreaking work in connecting up local place planning and community action planning in places like Lochalsh and in the Black Isle, and also in making sure that local place plans are as broad as they can be in terms of acting almost like an action plan in places like the Garnock Valley, where he's been working with folk. Certainly we are doing some work at the moment, bringing folk together who are supporting either CAPS and place planning to sort of advance that idea, and to try to connect it with what government's thinking is in the local governance review. So yeah, so that's a sort of movable picture at the moment.
Yes, and because local place plans have a statutory thing, so there's been a lot of focus on them. But one of the things that has always interested me is the minute you look at particularly a draft local place plan, it's not about just a local place plan. It's much bigger, and it's making sure that whole thing then gets captured, which is when it becomes an action plan. So it's a really holistic approach to place, but the action plans don't have the statutory thing that local place plans have. So it's like, and so you do need the local place plan. So it's not, my suggestion is not to fund the local place plans, but it's to then make sure that they feed into something which I would argue is more important for delivery for the community. And also for, if we all had community action plans, if every community had a community action plan, when funding becomes available, it becomes apparent where the money should be then directed, or what projects are going to be necessary within a community. Which
it's possibly worth just saying that as far as the local governance review is concerned, these action plans are also seen as a form of democratic expression in a participatory democratic context as well, in addition to what organisations might deliver on an ongoing basis. So that's worth saying.
Thanks, Mick. Now we only have 2 minutes left, and I suppose some of the other questions. What are the 10 places to allocate the money? That's not for us to say. That's beyond SURF's remit, so we can't do that. Alex, you've asked about research into intersectionality between poverty, place, public transport, etc. I don't think we really need to do research into that. Poverty is the problem. There are places in Scotland that are not well connected. And that are not 20-minute neighbourhoods and are not dense, etc. But people have high health outcomes because they're not in poverty. I can think of lots of rich neighbourhoods which don't comply with what a policy description would be of good design, but people are not experiencing poverty there. So poverty is the driver for huge amounts of things, and poverty also then intersects with transport because of demand and income. We are doing some research into local democracy and poverty. But on your particular question, Alex, Glasgow Council are doing some. If somebody could mute themselves, then I'm getting feedback. I think it's you, Mick. I've turned you off. Are doing some research into that. And what's clear is 20-minute neighbourhoods, the places that their 20-minute neighbourhoods are most prevalent are in the most deprived neighbourhoods in Scotland. They have bus services and they have services, but they may not have quality of those services, but they're still experiencing poverty. So 20-minute neighbourhoods are not something that address poverty. They're a kind of spatial thing, but the poverty is the problem in the place. And their research is increasingly kind of going down that line of looking at what that kind of decision-making means for places. But it's now 12 o'clock. Thank you very much for your comments, everyone, this morning. I'm sorry if we haven't got to all your questions. Obviously, I know that the Investing in Communities Fund is something that's pressing for quite a lot of you. And with some of you, I know I've communicated separately. We are pressing it out. There is a question within Parliament that we've seen that Jeremy Balfour has asked next Wednesday as to what the government's plans are for that. And if we hear anything in advance, we would let our network know of what that means. Kate, you have your hand up.
Yes, I've just literally had an email saying that they are looking at a transition year
for ICF funding. So if anybody is waiting for that email, I would suggest they go and have a look at their inbox now.
Kate, that's hot off the press. Thank you.
Fantastic.
Thank you very
Thank
much
you.
for that, Kate. We suspected that might be the case, but obviously the limbo period where people don't know is deeply unsettling. So thank you very much, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day. We should say that our shared learning workshops in May will be going ahead as usual. The next PIP is, what date is it, Emma? I've now forgotten.
It's the 30th of April, and I'm going to
Thir-
stick a link to the conference in the chat.
That's great. So our conference is also coming up in March, and bookings for that will be opening very shortly. Have a good day.